Hey everyone, today we're bringing a new story for you. Well, this is quite a peculiar work. In this story, we follow a protagonist who was ambushed by some powerful monsters. In the end, he was killed, but he got the chance from the system to come back to life. He could return, but also gained new things, like a Necromancer ability, which allows him to revive anyone with a shadow. Similar to a certain character, he ends up doing the same thing, raising the dead to fight and managing to take on powerful monsters alone or alongside his friend. But to truly understand this whole story, we need to go back to the beginning, to a dungeon. Then we observe a completely battered boy. He and his ally are in a very precarious situation, as he now finds himself faced with both light and darkness. For some reason, both are allied, and at this moment, he finds himself before the goddess of light and the demon king. At this point, he wonders why this demon king was allied with her. She then says that humans had no chance of defeating them, so it was better in the end to ally with them. However, our hero gets angry at this, yelling at her, calling her a loser for betraying humanity. But now, the Demon King says that this guy talks too much and will end him now. At this moment, he raises his finger, causing our protagonist to move upwards into the air. He is then compressed to a certain point, compressed to the extent that he ends up, let's say, exploding. At this point, he couldn't bear it and ended up dying. When he went to the afterlife, that dear system appeared, saying that he ended up obtaining the Demon Lord system. Not understanding, he asks what was happening but wakes up in another place, a sanctuary of demons. Yan Yong then opens his eyes and realizes he is in a completely unknown place. Beside him, there are several coffins, but he doesn't pay much attention to them because, looking to the side, he notices the system screen telling him he has now become the Demon Lord. With this title, he can summon some demons and at the same time turn some into something else. But he feels sad about this because he was always trying to fight against it. Yet now he has become what he fought. However, stopping to think, this power wouldn't be so bad, since he could use it to take revenge on that angel who betrayed him to side with the Demon King. With this power now in his hands, he is confident that he can take revenge. Yes, he needs to become stronger, and he will become the Demon Lord. At the moment he accepts this, he moves forward. The system asks him to stand in the center of the altar. At the moment he steps into the center, a lightning bolt strikes one of the coffins in front of him. At this point, things start to get more intense, and all that energy flows into our protagonist. Now, looking at the Angel of Light, he promises that she will wait for him because he will definitely go there to take his revenge. Meanwhile, the scene cuts to another place, a mountain where we see someone mourning a certain friend. This is our hero. But here he is sad because he essentially left his friend behind. Here we are introduced to him, a level 2 adventurer named Tung Jing. While he is standing there thinking about what to do with his life, he hears a voice asking why he would do such a thing. If he wanted to bury him, he could do it with a stone. He gets confused and turns around to find our hero alive and well. At this point, his jaw drops. How is this possible? He's alive! He starts crying, then gets angry because he spent 5 years coming to this place to visit him. But our hero doesn't care much about this, as he realizes his friend is still at level 2. Then they grab a motorcycle and start riding down the mountain until they see a statue of an angel. At this point, they ask what it is. His friend answers, saying that the angel fought against some demons and in the end, defeated them all. As gratitude, a statue was built in her honor. He thinks it's a farce, so the protagonist tells his friend the whole truth, who now believes what that angel was really about. But now that he's back, his friend wants to take him to a new restaurant that just opened. However, our hero refuses, saying he has to go home to grab some clothes, as he'll be waiting for his friend at the dungeon's entrance. His friend is upset because it would have been cheaper to go to the restaurant than the dungeon. The dungeon now requires payment for entry, which annoys our protagonist. Looking at the paper in his hand, he sees that a level 1 dungeon costs 10,000 coins and an 80% commission fee. His friend, nicknamed Melon Head, says it's not strange, as this has been happening for 5 years now. At this moment, annoyed, Melonhead grabs him by the collar and pulls him back. He asks Yongqing to calm down a bit, because the opponent has many allies on his side to fight. After a while, he starts telling the story of how, thousands of years ago, a battle between humans and the undead took place. But one day, an archmage named Layla sealed the entrance to one of the dungeons, giving humanity a bit of peace. However, over time, the seals on those dungeons weakened, allowing the monsters inside to come out. Chaos erupted in humanity until the adventurers emerged, where Lys fought against monsters. But in one of those adventures, his group appeared, his friend here, and he ended up commenting that in this dungeon he almost died. But then they enter a dungeon, and inside, he comments that now you need to pay 80% to enter. It was good because after the Goddess of Light had destroyed 100% of certain demons, the best dungeons were no longer considered something dangerous or something that, in the end, brought problems. So, these people who are interested in charging anything for entering decided to choose the dungeons to charge anyone who wanted to go in. At this moment, he also thanks his friend for paying to enter the dungeon, but he gets confused because he was being thanked even though he always treated them like the poor ones. Ignoring this, he ends up wondering why his friend dragged him into this dungeon. Then, his friend says he will need his help since he needs him to go to a certain place to find a strong opponent. His goal is to kill him to turn him into his shadow. But now they don't have time to talk, because a strong monster is heading in their direction, and at this moment, a scorpion appears. His friend, seeing the scorpion, asks him to stay there and watch his show. As he says this, his friend starts running toward the scorpion. When he gets close, the scorpion attacks, but he uses his shield to defend himself and then goes underneath, where he manages to cut the underside of the scorpion, defeating it. Watching from afar, our protagonist realizes that Jig Fun, his friend, is a human shield. But despite his fight being basically successful, he is still quite weak. He needs to level up a lot to reach a high enough level. At this point, our protagonist shouts for his friend to go ahead and kill more monsters, because with that, he could level up more. And so he obeys, going and killing one by one of these scorpions that were around. After a long time, all that's left are the carcasses of the creatures lying on the ground. After some time, our hero finally reaches level 2 alongside his friend. His friend already celebrates, saying he wasn't so bad after all. Then a screen appears, showing the status of Wang Wang, his friend. At the moment, he hadn't achieved much, but at this point, he's showing his friend something quite interesting. Clearly curious, his friend wonders what it is. At that moment, he already knew what ability he had. The scene cuts to our hero, who then commands the fallen creatures to rise and follow his orders. At this moment, a ray moves toward the carcasses of the scorpions on the ground. Minutes later, they rise. His friend, seeing this from our protagonist, is speechless. Minutes later, 2 scorpions appear, now under our protagonist's control. And now, when the hero sees these monsters transformed into human form, he is surprised to see that the transformation took on a human shape as well. But in the end, for him, this ability became so cool. Now he orders his pets to go ahead and kill all the monsters around. And as he commanded, they begin running and killing one by one. As they advanced, he noticed that the monsters being defeated were of the same level, but the summoned monsters were managing to defeat them very easily. His friend doesn't even pay attention to this, and instead focuses on another thing. These monsters could stay in the dungeon at a great distance, meaning he could be in bed, and his monsters would still be farming for him in the dungeon. After saying this, they ask our protagonist if, with these words, he didn't become a super genius. When he consulted the system, of course, our hero thought the same thing. However, that didn't happen because, for now, dungeons needed an adventurer inside them. But at the moment, he doesn't care much about that because now his goal is to go deeper into the dungeon to kill the Tail King, one of the powerful monsters inside. But while talking about this, something comes toward them. They look ahead to see what it is and realize it's Coco, one of the monsters our protagonist controls. Coco apologizes because he didn't notice the presence of the Tail King. His friend is left speechless, seeing how such a strong monster was defeated so easily by the Tail King. After hearing the apology, he says it's fine, as the monsters were only level 1, and it was very unlikely they'd be able to defeat the boss, the Tail King. So they advance and eventually reach the boss. The Tail King turns out to be a bit stronger than they had imagined. His friend, with courage, asks our hero to stay behind because he wanted to handle things personally. Our protagonist, knowing that this monster was powerful, asks him to step back instead. He wanted to test some new things, and besides, his friend wasn't a match for this boss. He needed to trust him to defeat the boss easily. At that moment, he wants to draw the boss's attention solely to himself. So, he points his finger and calls out to it, making the boss irritated. Now that he got what he wanted, he asks his friend to act the same way he was acting. Then he starts running to one side, and his friend starts running too. To another, and at this moment, the boss chose a certain person, our protagonist, to chase. At this point, he almost managed to catch our hero, but before he could grab him, he ended up activating a magical eye. Then he shouted for his friend Jing Feng to finish him off. At this moment, from behind, he began running as fast as he could. Minutes later, he found the weak spot of this monster, this boss. Finding the weak spot, he took his sword and pierced it inside. The boss, feeling the power of that sword, screamed in pain. At that moment, knowing he was about to be killed, he jumped down. But because he jumped down, the ground completely cracked. At this moment, both looked inside and realized they had caused significant damage. However, the thing they wanted to achieve, killing the boss, was still not accomplished. To defeat him, they needed to get past the thick armor the boss had. But our protagonist had a plan for this. His plan was to draw the boss's attention and then immobilize him. Once that was done, he asked his friend to finish off the boss as quickly as possible. Our protagonist suspected the boss would appear behind him to catch him, as his intuition was a bit unique. He then just asked his friend to stand firm, holding his sword. As soon as he could, he might first take a photo and not worry about him because he would be completely fine. So following this crazy idea, he ended up executing his plan. It happened as he predicted. The boss then appeared behind him, and at this moment, we see the protagonist's friend extending his sword toward the monster. By doing something like that, he managed to stab another weak spot of the monster, injuring it. But not even that was perhaps enough to stop this monster. The boss then used another of its paws to try to deliver a blow to his friend. Smartly, his friend used his shield to defend himself. Looking forward, he noticed the claw near his eye. But looking to the other side, he noticed our hero. He commented that he could hold off this monster for a certain amount of time, so the protagonist needed to act quickly. After hearing this, he flew toward the monster, holding his sword, which was still stuck in it. Grabbing the sword and running, he began slicing the monster from the inside out. He managed to make a great cut in it. In the end, he successfully defeated the monster. After defeating this monster, he ended up gaining some abilities and additional items in his stats. Moreover, he also obtained a shield and a dagger, both very powerful. Now that the boss was defeated, he saw the drops were good and understood why they chose this dungeon as the first one to enter. Our hero only commented that he had seen this type of boss in other dungeons, those high-level dungeons, so he thought that even low-level dungeons might have similar bosses. Now, he displayed the shield and the dagger. He wondered which of the two he should pick. He chose the shield. Meanwhile, his friend decided to pick the dagger, which left him confused since he had never used one before. But he revealed that he had some spare time and had trained with it a bit. At this moment, they began thinking that, with the profit they made here, they could pay off all their debts. Then the scene cuts to the place where they meet the Melon Head. The Melon Head charged almost 80% for letting them enter the dungeon. Now, he wanted to charge even more because of the food they had delivered to him. He also started demanding other things, like experience points they gained from killing any monster. Growing increasingly irritated, the protagonist listened to the Melon Head's words. He wanted to lash out at him, but his friend stopped him. Furious, he began to pull his sword out, but then stopped. He asked the Melon Head to leave. He also moved to another place where he noticed the presence of some level 1 bandits. Realizing he couldn't fight them now, he withdrew. But before leaving, the melonhead said that the protagonist had hurt his dear heart, Zoe. Now, realizing they had a very interesting shield, the melonhead demanded that they hand it over as a form of payment for the fee. Our hero walked away and asked his friend to give the shield to the melonhead, saying he would recover the shield and everything else the melonhead had taken anyway. Night fell, and the scene cut to the place where those bandits were. They were watching the news. On the news, there was a report about adventurers disappearing inside the dungeon. Then the bandits asked the adventurers. They were careful in the demise of the dungeon they were entering while they kept commenting about it. Rodo kept talking about some boss of his. However, out of nowhere, they began to feel a chilling breeze coming from below, and down there we could see someone, a melon-headed figure eating something uninteresting. The scene then shifts to outside this house, where we find two assassins who notice something strange happening. At first, they ignore it since they are basically in the desert, and nothing usually happens in the desert. But then, looking ahead, we notice that the boss's car had a rock in front of it that had fallen out of nowhere. Behind him, our hero appears. However, the scene cuts to inside the house, where we find the guy who was outside. He enters, but looks a little dizzy. His companions ask him what was happening with him, and as they take a closer look, they see that something bad had happened. At that moment, something jumps from behind him. Both of them look up but have no time to react because our protagonist jumps and strikes his head directly, pushing that adventurer backward. The other one, who was beside him, tried to use fire magic to hit our hero, but it was useless. With his speed, he easily dodged the first attack and started running toward him. Moments later, we see him making a slash, cutting that guy in half. Now that everyone was defeated, one still remained. They ask why he was doing this, but now he uses his magic eye, which does something as he runs toward this guy. The man doesn't understand what was happening. He only feels immense fear, so he just sits down. Meanwhile, our hero moves forward. Before entering inside, he notices a very cold atmosphere but cannot stay behind. He opens the door, and at that moment, he is surprised to find several adventurers in a dire situation. He realizes that the missing adventurers were right there, and the melon-headed figure was devouring them. But now that he was in this room, he would be the next to be devoured. Even more so as an adventurer who was merely level 2. His end would be here. But upon hearing this, he simply starts laughing out of nowhere. Then, he invites the figure to a good fight, commenting that he would join this fight. After all, he was in the mood to make a dessert, and the protagonist appeared at the perfect moment for him. The melon-headed figure then starts the fight, launching a fire beam toward him. But our hero dodges to the side, leaving the figure quite surprised and confused about what he was doing, until he sees him in front of him with a dagger in hand. The protagonist manages to land some slashes. However, at that moment, he notices something strange. The figure's level and speed didn't match what he had seen before. He sees the sword coming close to him. At that moment, the boy appears in front of him and finds it interesting to see that he can use fire magic and levitate. Now, he wants to make him one of his servants. But the figure, seeing himself in this situation, dislikes it and asks him to stop. Suddenly, something appears in his mouth, leaving him quite surprised. At that moment, an explosion occurs in the middle of the moon. We then observe the appearance of something mysterious. Only later do we reveal that this monster that appeared before him was a level 2 demon. At that moment, the figure is shocked to see that the chubby guy from earlier had basically found a strong opponent. But he wasn't someone of level 2. He thought about going back to that body until he looked to the side and noticed that only ashes of the chubby guy remain. He thought about going back to that body until he looked to the side and noticed that only ashes of the chubby guy remain. Finding this boring, he now realizes he needs to find another host. Looking to the side, our protagonist uses his skill in his direction, trying to catch this monster off guard. But no, he doesn't manage to. The monster's speed was much higher than our hero's movement. His speed was so high that he couldn't even clearly see him in front of him. He could only feel him. At that moment, something came in that direction. Seeing this, he jumped upward, and as he jumped, he was surprised to see that there was a hole in the ground. He realized it wasn't just fire, a fire that burned the ground instantly, as expected of an elite level 2 spell. Low-level people like him entering this second floor would likely have trouble facing a monster like this. Moreover, he notices that the space was too tight, giving a fire user like him complete advantage in this situation. So, he needs to lure him to another safer place. Running, we see him being chased. The monster yells that running to an open area or forest won't change anything. His fire was different. At this moment, the monster uses a fire skill aimed in his direction, but the protagonist keeps running, dodging through the forest. As he continues dodging, he eventually disappears, leaving the figure quite surprised. He asks where that guy went. He looks up and sees him above. The protagonist slashes downward, nearly hitting him, but the monster quickly dodges the attack. Even so, the protagonist manages to land a blow on the monster, leaving him very angry. The monster prepares fire in his hand to hit our protagonist directly. But before he can land the blow, our hero dodges at the last second. Grabbing part of the monster's clothing, he uses it as a way to escape faster, which ultimately works, leaving the monster increasingly enraged. He starts running faster toward our hero. Our protagonist also begins to run, and both meet in the middle of the forest. Upon meeting, the monster uses his fire to try to hit our protagonist, but the most he can do is hit some trees. As the protagonist runs, we see the destruction left behind. Continuing, he reaches a point where he cannot escape any further. Cornered here now, we observe a monster appearing behind our protagonist. Now that he's walked into a dead end, he wonders what he'll do to escape. The monster wants to see where he'll hide from his fire skill, which he launches in his direction. That fire heads toward our hero, devastating everything in its path. Everything is destroyed, including the mountain nearby, which ends up split in half. Everything turns to dust. The monster feels sad about this because that guy had seemed quite interesting to be his host. The last one he chose was a chubby guy who had a lot of diabetes, and among other diseases, he had a lot of difficulty staying in that body. Now he said no more chubby guys. Now he's going after those with bigger muscles and good health. At this moment, as he thinks about leaving, he feels a tremor. Then he looks down. He notices a crack. From that crack, something emerges that grabs him, immobilizing him. In this situation, he asks to wait a moment since that human should have been mere dust by now. Then he looks to the other side and notices a hole, and it's through there that he manages to escape. So far, it made him think he had won this fight, but at this moment, irritated, he comments that not even what just happened to him would be enough to stop him. Then he starts using his firepower again. But at that moment, a chain appears and moves toward his neck. Looking ahead, he finds our hero, who tells him to stop moving. An enormous pressure emanates from him, leaving him completely still and frightened. At this moment, he asks his tamed pet to release the guy. The pet obeys, and as soon as he's released, he stays quiet. But our hero demands that he hand over all the resources he had acquired earlier. The monster simply obeys, handing over the shield and other interesting weapons, as well as a massive collection of gold he had hoarded before. At this moment, he handed over everything that chubby guy had, the gold and the resources he had taken from our protagonist as well. But if he wanted more, he just needed to go to the guild since all the best things had been stored there. Looking at those gold bars, he realizes that selling them would fetch him 10 million on. This was surprising, seeing that guy managed to get all of that in a low-rank dungeon. However, focusing too much on what was beneath him, he lost all concentration, and the chain ended up breaking. The system appears, saying that danger was nearby and that it was better for him to hide. At this moment, the monster activates its fire ability and launches it toward our hero. But before it could hit him, he ducks. Right after ducking, he grabs the sword he got from the system, and with that, he finishes off the monster. In the end, he manages to defeat this level 2 demon, gaining XP and reaching level 2 as well. Upon reaching level 3, the system appears again, saying he could now enter any dungeon. However, upon entering a dungeon, monsters could also join, and they would fight for him. The XP gained would be distributed 100% to our protagonist, but this doesn't even catch his attention. Instead, it's the thing lying on the ground. He orders the thing to get up and follow his commands. At this moment, he gains 3 summons, but now he only has space for 2. Looking at his level, he realizes the summoned creature's level matches his own, so he doesn't need to train the monster from scratch. But the monster immediately asks for its first orders, wanting to know what it should do to fulfill its mission. At this moment, he knew that today's dungeons were all monopolized by some irregular guilds. So he looked for dungeons those guilds hadn't discovered yet. He knew the creature beside him was a monster, so he wondered if a monster like that could reveal where its companions were. If it did, it would be better to take him there since he could level up a lot and become much stronger. But here, the scene shifts to another location. Someone arrives at our hero's friend's house. It's a delivery person. They hand him a package, but he wonders about it because he wasn't expecting anything. So he takes it inside, where he notices it's heavy. At first, he even thinks it might be a brick, but it's not. At that moment, he opens it and is surprised to find his shield. Beneath it, he sees some gold bars as well. But among those items, he finds a letter saying the shield he needed had been recovered. He can't believe it. His shield was fully recovered. Along with it came some gold bars. Holding them, he feels happy since it's the first time he's held such gold, and now he thinks of himself as a rich man. At the door, we then see our hero's summoned creature, who comments that the delivery was made. Our hero thanks him but wonders if this was really the correct address he had mentioned earlier. After all, the place he's in is one of the temples of the God of Light. Why was he sent to this location now? The summoned creature continues, saying the power of a light angel is supported by many temples, both big and small. Shutting down one of these temples means losing power. If he truly wanted to attract the attention of the monsters, he would need to do that. Knowing all of this, he could now move forward. He then orders the scorpion to enter stealth mode, and it obeys. The scene shifts back to the place where that chubby guy was fighting our hero. They now wonder where his brother is. They comment it wasn't possible to find him. Furthermore, they found traces of fire magic never seen before, which hindered the investigation. But he orders them to keep investigating and find the culprit who did that to his brother. At the moment, though, the most important thing isn't even the deaths of those people or his brother. It's the 10 million on stolen by a certain someone. Moreover, if that goddess of light finds out the 10 million on was taken, he's totally screwed. Meanwhile, we see the scene cutting to another location. Here we see a corrupted light guard of level 3 being defeated. After defeating him, Reg gains 18 experience points. But based on combat experience, he gives one final warning. He orders the guard to surrender. He was once part of the Light faction and knows very well what's going on. However, this changes nothing for him. At this moment, he grabs his spear. Who had it? And tries to attack our protagonist knowing he wouldn't give up, so he ended up making the final cut, disconnecting the head from the body. He then felt a bit distracted until another corrupt guard appeared, and at that moment, he grabbed his sword to strike him. But at this moment, he turns as fast as he can and uses his eye, which ends up making this guard lose some concentration and fall to the ground. But taking down one wasn't enough, so other guards appeared, demanding that he be taken down as quickly as possible. Once again, he uses his eye there to try to land a blow, but the guards now used a shield, which prevented his power from reaching them. Realizing this, he then jumps upward, using one of the guards' heads as a springboard, and ends up landing a kick to the face of another guard standing right beside him. At that moment, we observe another guard appearing from the side with a sword in hand, attempting to strike a blow at our hero, but he easily managed to dodge, cutting both in half. Meanwhile, we see in the background the chief guards shouting for someone to stop that guy. He was just one person, so how had they failed to do something about him? In response, a higher-level guard appeared, trying to attack. At this moment, he stepped forward and aimed a blow at our protagonist, but on his way, he encountered several guards. Well, these guards were ultimately taken down with just 2 strikes by the boss standing just behind them. Now that this had happened, He comments that to defeat a monster or just one person, it was necessary to eliminate many guards. And so, ahead, we see more smoke clearing, and in the midst of it, we find our protagonist being protected by his pet. Protected now, he flips the middle finger and comments that the guy was trash and too weak. To this adventurer, he was considered a fool and would now regret having set foot in that clean place. At this moment, he grabs his axe, and after this, he prepares for the move. Just then, the scene cuts to another location where we find that guy from before, searching for a certain person. But he interrogates a man who was lying on the ground, asking if, by chance, he knew the guy he was showing on his cell phone. Apparently, he had built a guild but disappeared. However, as soon as he showed the phone to him, the man remembered this guy. It was Jing Fong. Knowing that he held the truth, he asked where this guy lived. Looking down, the man realized that if he revealed the wrong location, he would probably die. His companion, who was a strong fighter, had died from just one blow, so he ended up revealing the whole location. Now he asks if he can leave, and the man runs away, of course. But at this moment, we see the happy face of this guy, saying it was a joke. At this moment, he raises his finger, and at that point, the guy who was running suddenly stops. Somehow, something had pierced him. At this moment, he should be heading to his next target. The scene then cuts to the place where Jing Feng was. Jay Feng was in a good mood at home until he heard the doorbell. He opens the door and wonders who the guy was. Then he asks if he is Jing Feng, but our story changes scenes again. Now to a temple. We see a boss, and below that boss, we see our protagonist. At this moment, the boss wonders how someone could have let an insect like him enter his territory. However, he had an answer for that. At this moment, our protagonist places his hand behind him, inserting it into a portal. Moments later, he pulls something out of it and then throws it toward this boss. The boss then realizes that, at this moment, he had defeated a third-level elite warrior. He saw that this insect that entered his territory wasn't an ordinary insect. At this moment, he rises, drawing his sword from his system. Then he simply said the others were weak, and now he had no idea who he was facing. We then see him using that eye of his, and at this moment, a wave goes toward this knight. But what had been affecting the weaker knights had no effect at all on this one. He was surprised by this, but moments later, we see the knight leaping toward him, lowering to catch our hero. But he jumps backward, dodging. Yet the knight prepares another attack. To avoid being struck by this other attack, our hero draws his dagger from his system, holding off the blow for a few moments. He then realizes that this boss might be a bit harder to beat than the others he had faced. From above, we see the knight charging toward him, trying to grab him mid-air. But our protagonist doesn't stop there. He uses fire from his summons, sending it toward the knight. The knight, however, uses his sword as a shield, completely defending against the fire. But then we see that the fire caused an explosion. Yet, this explosion didn't even affect the knight. The fire's effect, however, was quite strong. He noticed this. His level was much higher, and so was his defense. But why had he ended up losing to this low-level fire ability? At that moment, our hero appears with his dagger, taking advantage of one of the openings that had appeared to him. Striking from behind, he wonders if that wasn't a dirty move. At this moment, he retrieves his dagger and says no. At the same time, he says that the goddess of light, who until recently had been humanity's ally, suddenly decided to betray humanity. So this means nothing. At this moment, we see that the knight wouldn't be defeated so easily. At this moment, he then turns toward our hero. To catch him quickly, our protagonist dodges, and his strike lands. He realizes he hit a vital point. How was he still alive? Then he notices that he was healing himself. He saw something that piqued his interest. This healing. He didn't have that. The boss moves toward him and ends up striking our protagonist squarely with his blows, throwing him back a little. Now he grips his sword and orders that this adventurer be exterminated and turned into nothing but dust. He releases a gigantic aura toward him. The aura travels to reach our protagonist from afar. From the island, we observe the cutting ray of that knight's sword. Now that he defeated this, he could return to his throne. But as he returned, he wondered what was happening. This adventurer was different. He couldn't even feel his presence upon entering his territory. Well, everything he said was true. He heard a voice. It was our protagonist's. He couldn't believe it. How was he still alive? But our hero began telling a story out of nowhere. Many years ago, he was a novice. But on one of his novice adventures, he ended up being robbed by a team that stole a very good magic stone from him. These people who robbed him were part of a guild called Shiper. One of his friends ended up dying during this ordeal. The person who committed the wrongdoing was not punished at that time because he held a high status in the guild, and the person responsible for taking certain actions was him. But at this moment, he wonders if the one responsible for doing that is here in this place. And he says that the weak must remain below him, and as proof of this, he wants to eliminate our hero. This time, he will unleash a power much stronger than the last. He underestimated the boy before, which allowed him to survive, but this time it will be different. He pours much more aura into his sword. As soon as he imbued it with that aura, the sword grew to a gigantic size. This place is part of his territory, and here, anyone who enters without his permission is subject to being subdued. At that moment, to avoid being caught, he moves backward. He realizes he can indeed feel the power emanating from that sword. He has a trick that can still be used to defeat him. So he uses one of his abilities, which is a shield. The knight wonders if he's really confident that he can defend against his sacred sword with that small shield. At this moment, he decides to test it. So he throws the sword toward our protagonist. The sword then meets our hero's shield. The shield held strong. From afar, the knight realized that this was a level 3 guy. But for him to wield a shield of this level was something surprising. Unfortunately for him, though, his end was near. Our protagonist's shield was reinforced, causing that knight's sword to completely break, shattering into pieces. Then we observe an explosion happening. He realizes that too much mana was released. Perhaps now he wouldn't even survive this. After some time, the explosion fades away, and in the middle of the explosion, there he was, completely fine and alive. This leaves the knight surprised. How could he survive again? That sword alone had the power to destroy any adventurer. Our hero said that the ability Bug Flam de Pang Jin was transformed into a shield, and in fact, it had basically the same result. However, there is a weakness in this ability of his. His opponent must be at a level close to his own. If not, he would likely lose. But this time, now it was his turn to counterattack this guy. However, to defeat this knight, he would need to use all the mana he had left. So he used all his remaining mana, and at that moment, a fire beam flew toward the knight. Seeing this, the knight tries to grab his sword and seems to try to grab the shield to defend himself. The fire gets close, but there was a shield that defended him. The impact happened, and at this moment, he felt the full power of it. He wondered where all that power came from. We observe the fire increasing. From the island, we observe how big the fire became, larger than the ability of his sword earlier. After some time, the fire from our hero disappears. In the middle of that fire, we find the knight, who ends up praising our hero, saying that he was quite a powerful adventurer. Among all the adventurers he had trampled on, he was the strongest, but unfortunately, for him, it was nothing. These scratches, these cuts, all of it could be healed in minutes. Until then, he notices something. He looks over and wonders what that was. At this moment, we observe an aura coming out of him. He wonders if something would happen if there was no more healing for him. He asks himself what kind of effect was placed on him when that fire ability was used. But this time, he can't take it. He falls to his knees. This time, it was the second time he fell to his knees. He approaches this knight, and now wonders why a sacred knight kneeled twice before an adventurer like our protagonist. Knowing that he would be defeated by this adventurer, he apologizes and asks for forgiveness. But at this moment, our hero tells him to shut up because he hasn't finished the story yet. After a certain event involving his friend, he ended up losing all his jobs. And now, companies wouldn't accept him because a certain family was against this certain friend of his. Thus, people behind it wondered why he offended the Zhu family, as this family was quite influential, turning his life into complete ruin. And if he were a friend of our protagonist, he likely wouldn't live long. With this entire situation happening to his friend, he ends up opting for a very sad solution. The friend of our protagonist, the silver one, goes to his house. But at this moment, when he arrives, he knocks on the door, but no one answers. So he just invades the house. And in the end, he finds his friend there. Unfortunately, in another world now. He picks up the sword. The adventurer who was on the ground now wonders if burning that thing in front of him was still worth forgiving him. At this moment, the knight ends up saying not to kill him and, at the same time, asks him to demand everything from him because he would do whatever he wished. Our protagonist even agrees. At this point, the knight notices that he stopped paying attention to the fight, so he could take the opportunity to attack him, as he still had a little bit of magic left. But at the moment, he thinks about doing something like this. Our protagonist grabs his own sword and slashes it across him. Our hero, after doing this, ends up saying that he can follow him, but only as his shadow. Now, speaking of shadows, he ends up thinking that one of his other shadows was in a dungeon. And so far, he hasn't even heard back from it. So he contacts his other shadow and asks himself what it was doing. Where was its experience? It comments that it ended up getting into a rather complicated situation. It was facing an adventurer while his friend was in a very critical situation. The hunter who was after the friend of our protagonist wonders who this guy was, but ends up saying that he could kill any human he finds in this city except that one. And for that, he would have to fight at 100% in this battle, because if he did so, Yongqing would give him a punishment that was not so good. At this moment, the friend of our protagonist realizes that Yongqing ended up acquiring an excellent friend, indeed a very good friend, who is even protecting him. So he asks him to be very careful because the guy in front of him was strong. But to understand everything, we need to go back a few hours. At that moment, he was at home, relaxed, until that guy showed up. He grabs him by the face and throws him out the window, and with the impact, he ended up fainting. The friend of our hero passes out, but the scene returns to the present. The guy who was there disappears, but reappears minutes later in front of him. He is surprised by his speed, which might even be faster than that of our protagonist. He is thrown backward. At this moment, while being thrown back, he summons something in his hand. And at that moment, he falls entirely into that thing. But before being caught by it, he manages to dodge at the last moment, stopping in midair. That adventurer wonders how he managed to do that since it was an invisible blade. He says he didn't see it, but only felt it. He knows he must be careful. This adventurer is a little strong, and at the same time, he cannot let the friend of our protagonist die. So, for this, he must give his best. An adventurer nearby tries to punch him in the face, but he manages to dodge at the last moment. However, it wasn't enough because he gets kicked in the face, which throws him backward. Being thrown backward, he ends up falling, but once again, another invisible blade appears. But again, he dodges it. He wanted to use that demonic form of his because, with it, he could easily defeat that guy, but the protagonist tells him not to do it. At this moment, the adventurer moves that invisible blade towards that guy, cutting him in half. At this moment, he falls and becomes sad to see that he couldn't even protect a friend of our protagonist. The adventurer approaches and comments that his blade doesn't stay still either. It moves. The adventurer asks him to go to that warm place over there. He apologizes to our hero for failing to fulfill such a simple task. And at this moment, that blade hits him, but something happens. He disappears, leaving that adventurer completely surprised. Then he looks to the side and notices the presence of another person. He sees that guy over there, but is startled to see that he couldn't even sense the presence of that other adventurer. Now that the defeated one lies down, our protagonist wonders how he managed to be defeated. He was considered a human shield, but his friend ends up saying that he's only alive now because the friend of our protagonist appeared and saved his life. That adventurer wonders who this guy was who just appeared. Besides, he doesn't care about that because his objective was to eliminate the guy down there. But now our protagonist interrupts and asks him to shut up, because now is not the time for him to speak. He asks Rudy to take Jay Fang to a safer place. So it is done. He picks up Jay Fang and takes him to a safer place. But at this moment, As he tries to leave, we notice an adventurer appearing behind him, trying to strike him with a blow, but the one who was quicker in this play was our protagonist. Our protagonist managed to land a blow square on his face, sending him spinning backward. He continues to say that it still wasn't his turn to be speaking. He ends up being slammed into the wall. Once slammed into the wall, he gets up, spitting blood. Now he looks ahead and realizes that this guy in front of him is different from everyone he's seen in those dungeons roaming around. They were all weak, but this one always appeared in his statistics, and it always looked weak. He didn't care much about it, but now everything was different. So he needed to take this fight a bit more seriously. At this moment, our protagonist then decides to retreat a little. But as he does this, he ends up smiling and says that he just fell into his trap. Two invisible daggers head toward the legs of our protagonist, Hero, to try to catch him. Of course, that caught him, so our protagonist ended up cutting him a little, but it still wasn't time to defeat him. Our hero gets close to him, noticing that both were fast. He liked our black guy, but he was a somewhat unknown man. But how could an unknown guy be competing with him? At this moment, Mora, the south of our protagonist, that invisible sword ends up being broken, leaving him completely speechless and in disbelief. He even notices that the light coming from our protagonist was from a sacred knight. But in the end, to be honest, that ability he used was quite disappointing. He thought it would be stronger than he imagined. Being a level 4 adventurer, he was surprised to see that he was too weak. He had even prepared a little before, at least to have a fair fight. But in the end, he didn't even need to prepare that much. So he opted to withdraw, leaving the guy totally irritated. At that moment, trembling in anger, he raises it high, then ends up shouting for his strongest abilities to be activated. As he says such a thing, we then observe several cuts going in different directions, slicing everything around them. But these cuts clearly head towards our protagonist. However, before being caught by those cuts, he uses that sacred light again. At this moment, dust ends up rising due to the various cuts that happened there. After the dust clears, we see our protagonist doing fine. He then comments that now he could leave in peace too. The other guy appears behind him. He realizes that not even that ability was enough to break his defense. However, now he would be attacking head-on. But this frontal attack was invalid against him. At that moment, that dagger then goes toward our protagonist, but now it kind of hit him. After that, he comments that this sword was made by some devils, which ended up giving him a greater advantage over our protagonist. But after finishing saying this, he wonders if what he just said was serious, and he realizes that the dagger didn't stay on our protagonist. Something invisible held that sword of his. But in the end, that strongest sword he had ended up being broken. He is left in disbelief, but at that moment, our protagonist knees him in the face, which makes him get thrown upward, so high that he ends up breaking through that wall at the top. Now he can't believe it. He had 2 shields. How could he know that? Now up high, we can see our protagonist appearing. He would be putting an end to this adventurer, but he asks him to stop because if he went forward, the Zhong family, the same one that ended the life of our protagonist's friend, would be coming after him. He doesn't care about that and ends up asking for them to really come at him. He activates that fire of his. With that fire activated, he ends up hitting that adventurer full on, throwing him against a mountain. The explosion happens, and in the end, we only see his body on the ground, defeated. He couldn't do anything else. In the background, we then see the friends of our protagonist and that new summon of his, watching all of this happen. With this fight, we then see that the shadow said his evolution was remarkable. It seemed like he had basically undergone a gigantic evolution, making the level of his opponent quite useless. On the other hand, the friend of our protagonist ends up agreeing that the improvement he achieved was quite incredible. The level of our protagonist ended up surpassing the level of his opponent. Now, looking at him, he realizes that staying close to our protagonist was interesting. The evolution was intriguing, which makes him quite promising and makes him think that perhaps the protagonist could bring the demonic clan back to the real world. Meanwhile, the scene shifts to him, where he encounters the guy he just defeated. Now that he got close to his opponent, he realized he ended up gaining a lot of experience. It's like you gain more by killing an adventurer than by killing a monster. But at that moment, he ends up thinking that in his past life, he never even had the courage to do that. Moreover, the guild he was part of prohibited him from doing such a thing. So, in the end, calculating all this, he realizes that earning XP at the expense of adventurers was easier than killing monsters. But in the underground of level 3, we then see the scene happening inside the dungeon. We find some adventurers and some hooded tied-up people. Minutes later, another level 6 adventurer appears and cuts him down. Observing all of this, it was part of the evolution he was looking for. But now in the dungeon, he wonders why this guy was with him inside the dungeon. He doesn't answer his question, but instead wanted to know why he put hoods on. The victims he decides to hunt. This madman, missing a screw, reveals the reason. And the reason wasn't good. But at that moment, he wonders why he came here to the dungeon. He didn't just come to the dungeon to watch the crazy things this guy was doing. He reveals that he only came here to help him level up. He was looking for adventurers because, for him, adventurers gave more XP and leveled up his levels faster. Then, the man shows a picture of a guy saying that this guy was on level 3. But as soon as he managed somehow to capture him and maybe kill him in the end, he would be able to get a lot of XP from him. For some reason, this guy he's hunting now is a little more different from the ones he hunted before. But while he was thinking about what he would do to hunt him, sending a letter to another location, we then observe our protagonist sitting while his friend was working out. But at the same time, he comments that he had healed him just recently. So it wasn't that good to keep working out at the same time, but he said he was fine. Only now he wonders why he wasn't anxious about entering a dungeon to level up. Then he responds that yes, he was anxious, and he was dying to know what level he would reach. Somewhere else, he tells his friend that there was something farming XP for him. The scene then cuts to a totally unfamiliar place, or rather, to the dungeon. In this dungeon, we then observe that summoning of our hero. He was in a level 5 territory, summoning those lower-level invocations so that they would deal with the monsters. After they were finished, he looked at them with a look of disdain. They commented that everyone there belonged to one master and that the master had ordered everyone there to fight and finish the monsters as quickly as possible. However, he wasn't just sitting there giving them orders. Then, one of the shadows points a sword in his direction and demands that he get up and do something. He responds by saying that he was the first summon, so he basically had the right to be bossing the weaker ones around. While looking down, they notice one of the summons chasing after a cricket. But instead of continuing the argument, the stronger shadow ends up making a bet, or rather, wanting to make a bet with everyone to see who could earn the most XP. At that moment, as he talks about it, he jumps toward a gigantic horde of monsters that was appearing. They were all level 5, but with a single hand movement, he manages to completely destroy that wave of monsters. All the XP goes to our hero. Meanwhile, we observe that from those monsters, only Ash remained. With this feat, he would undoubtedly earn some bonuses from our protagonist. However, as he was thinking about what he could do to earn bonuses, one of the monsters suddenly appears behind him. But this one doesn't get much screen time, as with a single slash from that guy, who had already cut our protagonist in half before it was sliced to pieces. After that, he scolds this guy, but at that moment, another monster tries its luck. However, with a single hand movement, he manages to split this monster in two. Still, there were more behind him. So, he starts performing another move, sending several slashes toward that group of monsters, cutting each one of them. But it wasn't over yet, as there were still many monsters around. One of the corrupt light guards from before ends up somewhat thanking the others for gathering all the monsters into a line. The other shadows tell him to wait because there were still things to be done, but it's no use. He then uses his sacred sword, which visibly grows, and then a gigantic H appears from it. What we see next is a slash cutting all the monsters in front of him, causing infinite XP to stack up in our protagonist's account. Meanwhile, he comments that his summons were indeed eager to earn XP, but now he ends up finding himself in another location. However, someone calls for Yongqing. At this point, when he sees the group, he notices there is now a dwarf among them. He approaches his friend and asks why he brought a dwarf, considering dwarves are used to spotting any shiny ore in the middle of the cave, which often draws their attention. This usually causes, in the end, some accidents. The last few times, some dwarves caused accidents that attracted many monsters to the group. The dwarf, of course, overheard all this and ended up dropping his axe on the ground. Then he comments that everything they said was a lie since there are no dwarves like that anymore. But he was different. He was a more distinctive dwarf, preferring to be an ally rather than a hindrance. He starts teasing the dwarf, making him irritated. His friend defends the dwarf, saying he's trustworthy. He turns to his friend and comments that there were supposed to be more than 30 adventurers there, but his friend replies that it's likely they couldn't find those 30. So he ended up kind of putting their guild name somewhere else. This place was where random adventurers came, and incidentally, one had just arrived. This one was a giant. Looking at her, we see her size. She was an adventurer from the giant tribe. But as soon as the adventurers saw her, she quickly hid behind a rock. As soon as she hid, our protagonist points out and comments that there was still one more adventurer missing. When he mentions this last adventurer, he immediately appears and apologizes for he had to be late. He was a level 4 adventurer arriving. I already comment that these novice adventurers here probably thought he was a newbie at first, but in the end, they don't even know the real story. Now our PR's friend introduces him to the group, saying that he was a guy who was looking for a team and begged to be included in the hero's team. At this point, he ended up commenting that he was level 4. Despite his level, he was good at combat. Up until then, our protagonist looked at him and realized that this guy was never, in his wildest dreams, a level 4 adventurer. He had seen this guy somewhere before, but he ignores it, so they start heading towards the portal in front of them, which was at level 6. But here we go back 2 hours, where we find our protagonist and his group forming. While he was looking for a team, our hero was looking for a dungeon. He found one, but there was a boss inside that was stronger than him. But this dungeon was worth entering, so at this moment, our hero chooses it, and his friend goes to find their group. They open the door, and are now inside the dungeon. It's all dark. We see this level 4 adventurer commenting that he was really scared, it was terrifying. Then, that girl from the giant tribe appears and offers him a lollipop, since in situations like this it tends to calm people down. He was a little startled by the size of the lollipop, but ignored it. Our hero turns to his group and asks where the dwarf is. Of course, no one knows. A dwarf warrior observed something surprising. He admired gigantic blue crystals and murmured in amazement. The dwarf exclaimed about the number of magical blue crystals, imagining himself becoming rich, and began striking them. He expressed his surprise at the vast amount of crystals. He noticed that the crystals were everywhere and thought he might find rare crystals deeper in the cave. He whispered quietly as he gazed at the horizon, noticing something emanating light. The dwarf saw a bright yellow stone. He shouted for finally having found the stone and leapt toward it, blaming everything on it. He struck it with a sharp blow, destroying the yellow crystals. The dwarf broke the stone, and energy emanated from it, leaving him startled as he exclaimed what was happening. A character asked if someone else had entered the cave, while the group commented on the high probability of finding something important. The protagonist's friend asked in disbelief what was happening. He pointed, asking if that wasn't a demon. The dwarf warrior shouted for them to move quickly. He ran and screamed as several golems chased him. A guy in orange, smiling and brandishing his sword, remarked about the dwarf's fear of the stone monsters. The dwarf was startled when a giant creature appeared behind him. A giant statue chased the dwarf, who screamed in terror as he ran desperately. The protagonist's friend was frightened. A man with a mustache considered taking down a few, but an unexpected and more threatening opponent arrived. He fled, thinking it was better to lose experience than his life, while the other two watched. They were surprised by the green glow emanating from the cave. A massive green explosion filled the area. He escaped, running from the collapsing cave. The statue advanced toward the protagonist's friend, who screamed in fear and fled desperately. It roared, its eyes glowing as it prepared a green energy attack. It spat a bright green liquid, roaring in fury. The green slime was about to hit the group. The protagonist ran toward the statue. The orange-clad friend, running, asked what was happening, while the protagonist stood before the statue, shouting that it was impossible to escape such a massive attack. The protagonist told everyone to gather around him. He created a cross-shaped energy shield. The slime struck the protagonist's shield. It began to melt the shield. He screamed as a green energy hit him, reaching his hand. The green slime struck him, almost reaching the protagonist's friend. The protagonist thought that his level 5 shield couldn't withstand the level 7 boss's attacks, and it only protected him, meaning his friends would be hit. He created a dark and bloody energy with his hand. He hurled the energy to the ground, and a red and black stream spread out. The warrior roared while the boy watched, frightened. The protagonist summoned a level 5 beast, which roared. The dwarf wondered if he was hallucinating about an adventurer summoning demons, thinking that such magic was absurd, and even the best adventurers couldn't do it. The protagonist shouted, asking everyone to hold on because he would get them out of there, demonstrating his leadership at that moment. The creature began digging into the ground, opening a path for their escape, showing the power of the summoned creature. The protagonist tried to convince his friend to enter the hole, demonstrating his concern for everyone's safety. He assured his friend that everything would be fine, encouraging him to leave, showing his determination and leadership. A red-haired girl descended, mentioning that they would go first, and questioning if the other would follow afterward, demonstrating her concern. A blonde man stated that he couldn't go because if he removed the shield, the boss's liquid would flood the tunnel, revealing the danger they were in. The blonde man commented that the dwarf had leveled up, which caused astonishment, something he never expected to happen. He observed the statue walking toward a puddle of slime, showing that the creature had a goal. He thought he had run fast, and if he hadn't, he would have turned into a bloody mess, showing that the escape had been crucial. The statue looked at the green glow of the slime, demonstrating interest in what was happening there. The statue, with glowing eyes and green tears, murmured something inaudible, expressing intense suffering, something everyone could feel. The protagonist used his powers to repel the green slime, protecting everyone, demonstrating his strength and leadership. A mustached man commented that the boy had absorbed the boss's abilities, expressing his surprise. He remarked that a level 7 dominated a level 5 easily, and questioned how that had happened, something that went against logic. The protagonist, with incandescent energy in his hand, remained silent, showing he was focusing on the fight. A man observed a monster and questioned how the boy had evolved, demonstrating everyone's surprise at the protagonist's power. He wondered how he had leveled up without fighting any monsters, showing his perplexity at what was happening and expressing everyone's confusion. 5 minutes earlier, a grinning monster with glowing yellow eyes was shown, revealing a plan. A monstrous hand emerged from the rocks, demonstrating the creature's power. The monster declared it had eliminated almost all the monsters and questioned whether the boss would evolve, revealing the plan in action. The monster commented about something good coming to an end, indicating that the fight was nearing its conclusion. Another monster growled, asking the other not to underestimate it, showing it also had great power. It shouted that it wanted to join the battle and would sense the master to make him summon it, revealing its ambition. The protagonist prepared for an imminent attack with a tense face, demonstrating that he was ready to fight. A giant statue's foot fell toward the ground, causing great destruction and showed the creature's power. It hit the ground, and the protagonist dodged. A great explosion of energy occurred, demonstrating the statue's power. The protagonist thought that, against creatures so large, an attack on the lower part would be more effective, showing his battle strategy. The protagonist attacked with a golden sword, cutting his opponent, demonstrating his combat skill. It began to fall, screaming, and the impact caused a deafening crash. The power of the battle was incredible. It fell, and a great explosion occurred, showing the result of the attack. The protagonist stood, holding his sword, ready for another confrontation. He ran with his sword in hand, its blade glowing with energy, showing that he would not give up. He leaped to attack, delivering a sword strike charged with electricity, showing his power and agility. He struck a blow, and the statue tried to block it with its hand, but could not prevent the attack. The protagonist was captured by the statue, placing him in a position of danger. The fight had reached a critical moment. The statue cracked and screamed in pain as it held the protagonist, showing the strength of the protagonist's strike. She clenched her fist tightly as an intense yellow energy radiated, demonstrating her maximum power. He freed himself from her hand, breaking everything with a circular attack, showing his power and strength. He struck the statue's head with a powerful blow, causing it to shatter, demonstrating the power of that attack. He broke the sword with a strike, and lightning emanated from the crack, showing how powerful the energy released in that moment was. An intense yellow lightning bolt tore through everything, surrounded by debris and flames, showing the result of the powerful attack. Everything was destroyed, and everyone watched the chaos, showing the outcome of the entire battle. The dwarf was surprised, mentioning that a level 6 adventurer defeated a rare level 7 boss, while the others smiled, showing that everyone was impressed by the result of the fight. A blonde man commented that it was all drama and basic for him, while the protagonist stated that something was not right, revealing his concern. He mentioned that despite almost running out of energy, it was a rare boss and the fight was unbalanced, demonstrating that the victory had not been easy. Green slime burst from the ground, and he expressed his surprise, showing that the battle was far from over. She approached the protagonist. The danger was imminent. She began to grow, and there was a bright green explosion, turning the fight into something even more dangerous. A bright yellow sphere emanated green lightning over the protagonist, putting his life at risk. A massive explosion occurred, turning the battlefield into chaos. The explosion was seen from afar, demonstrating the magnitude of the battle. The protagonist jumped, escaping the green slime that chased him, fighting for survival. The battle was far from over. He thought his magic was low, and that his armor wouldn't last long, showing the danger he was in. He observed the green magic, trying to understand what was happening. The warrior asked what that mist was, and the blonde man replied that it was vapor from an overheated toxic liquid, showing the danger of the situation. The blonde man took a deep breath with a serious expression, showing his concern about what was to come. He mentioned that the boss had a second phase and that the battle environment had worsened, questioning why it hadn't summoned its minions, revealing that the fight was not over. There were no dialogues in the image, only a scenario of a dark sky and rocky mountains with vegetation. The protagonist thought about postponing the fight and questioned the hidden enemy, showing that he wasn't going to attack without a plan. He heard a sound as he moved, something that caught his attention during his journey. He widened his eyes, showing surprise at what he was seeing or hearing. Something unexpected had occurred. He dodged an attack, a red whirlwind, demonstrating his agility and reflexes at that moment. A ball of energy flew by, leaving a trail, demonstrating its speed and strength, showcasing the power of that magic. He caused an explosion, with a glowing red symbol emerging from the detonation, a powerful and impressive attack. The protagonist observed a hand emerging from the darkness, something frightening and mysterious, showing that the battle was far from over. He activated his shield to defend against the attack, preparing for what lay ahead. The protagonist thought the boss had figured out his armor, but he underestimated him, showing that he still had tricks up his sleeve. He dodged the blow, displaying his agility and reflexes, showing the power he had in battle. She widened her eyes, showing surprise at the speed of her opponent. The power of that attack was shocking. She could only see the golden blade coming toward her. A silent scream escaped her lips, revealing her fear at the moment of death. Her head was severed, marking the end of the battle for her at that moment. The fight was over for one side. The warrior stated that it was all over, demonstrating his relief after the confrontation. It was the end of another battle. The protagonist's friend waved and called out his name, showing his happiness at seeing him safe and sound. The protagonist asked about the others, and the blonde man explained that he would retrieve the ore fragments, and the girl accompanied him, showing that each had their role in that journey. In the cave, the dwarf collected crystals, demonstrating his greed and obsession with wealth, something that motivated his actions. He held a blue crystal, shouting that no magic could escape his control, showing his arrogance and greed, revealing his true nature. A foot crushed the shining stone, and he screamed as he tried to reach it, showing his despair and loss. Everything he wanted was gone. Our story begins with a foot stepping on that miner until realizing that the one who stepped was the giant. He then asks himself why she did that. Until then, she starts speaking, asking if by any chance he wasn't paying attention to his surroundings. So startled, he turns to the side, where he notices that below there were several skeletons of some creatures. And at the end, we realize that the dwarf had fallen under a spell of the dwarf king. Now he asks the giant if she, by any chance, also fell under this spell. She says no, since for some reason the gas was on a lower layer, and the dwarf was fully within this layer. Meanwhile, we observe our protagonist's friend saying that he will be going back to call the rest of the group, but with no response, he reaches his hand toward Yongqing, only for a sudden cut to appear, slicing his hand. He then gets startled and screams. But now, looking to the side, he realizes that Yongqing had fallen. Just moments ago, he was standing right in front of him. What happened? But also, who cut his hand? The boss wasn't dead until he realized something. That wasn't exactly what happened. Beside him, the boss appears, slashing him, and he simply collapses to the ground. And only after all this, we see the boss appearing right beside him after striking down an adventurer. She starts looking at the hand and is surprised by the cuts she made. However, adventurers were interesting to her, and this adventurer who had defeated her just moments ago. She wanted to take his body to study it a little. So, he charges toward Yongqing to strike her, but before he can do that, the Stained One moves toward her. She notices this and raises her hand to defend against the strike, but even that wasn't enough, causing her to be thrown to the side. After this, the Stained One moves toward the dwarf's hand. The dwarf then looks toward the face of our hero's friend, who was lying there. And maybe now, the dwarf realizes that it wasn't just him who was poisoned, but the entire group. Maybe all of this was part of a hallucination caused by that poison. But it still wasn't too late. They could still win. However, looking toward that dwarf, she asks herself why the dwarf was here. The dwarf should have been dreaming and collecting those valuable crystals. But then, the boss also wonders where that giant was. She was missing from the dwarf's group, until suddenly he notices an arrow flying rapidly in his direction. However, she notices it just in time and manages to dodge it. If she hadn't, the damage would have been severe, as just one arrow was capable of splitting that tree in half. And as the arrow passes right beside her, she turns toward the forest, where she finds the girl, and realizes that she was good at hiding. Then, the dwarf appears from behind with a hammer, intending to strike her. But she quickly turns and defends herself. Now that she is closer, she realizes that this dwarf is 2 levels below her, and she wonders why such a weak creature like him was trying to fight her. But since he got closer, that was good. It meant she didn't have to approach the dwarf herself to grab him. So, she activates that slime again and moves toward the dwarf. The dwarf fails to dodge properly and gets caught by it. Suddenly, another arrow flies in her direction. She notices it and turns to try to block the arrow. But then, out of nowhere, the dwarf appears and grabs her leg. She is surprised to see that the dwarf was still alive. But now it was too late to dodge the arrow, and the arrow ends up hitting her, causing a thick smoke to rise. Lying on the ground, the dwarf says he has a certain special ability that helped him stay alive. This was the stone skin. Although this ability is quite weak, he still managed to hold out for quite a while. At that moment, the smoke clears, and we can see that the boss managed to catch that arrow. But now, the arrow had somewhat melted from her poison. Yet we realize that even this was not enough to scratch her. With her mouth open, after all that, she even comments that their levels were too low. Their strength was nothing. Then, she attacks the dwarf with poison again, causing him damage. The hidden giant ends up screaming his name, and because of that, the boss finds her. After that, she just points her finger in the giant's direction, and a venomous arrow streaks toward the giant, hitting her completely. Now everyone falls to the ground, and she could finally continue her studies, until she realizes that there were two people missing here, one in a red shirt and another one who was lying there fallen. And to understand where they ended up, we observed a trail of blood. As she followed it, further ahead, we saw that our protagonist's friend was carrying him to a safer place. He couldn't be dying here, but from behind, we saw the boy extending his hand in their direction and then launching that venomous blast again. That thing moved toward them. Our protagonist's friend only saw it getting closer, but in the end, they were all caught. It was a shame to do this, because among those two there was a particularly special adventurer, and she wanted to study him further. It was a shame. However, a persistent hand emerged from the midst of that poison. It was Yongqing, and now he had reached level 7. After waiting a bit, he had finally understood how his abilities worked. But the boss was surprised. How had he managed to level up? To understand this, we need to look into his shadows. At that moment, the shadow had managed to defeat a very powerful boss. And then, the strongest shadow commented that, with this boss defeated, it was very likely that its master would now be at level 7. Returning to the protagonist, he commented that, from the very beginning, everything they had lived through had been almost like a dream, created by that boss's poison. But now, it was all over. At that moment, he extended his hand, but now he realized that the poisonous gas could be ignited. When he lit that flame, he just hadn't seen it before because his level had been too low. He hadn't noticed it before either. At that moment, she used that poisonous gas again, directing it at him and engulfing him completely. She even celebrated, believing it was his end, until she realized that the protagonist had managed to dodge the first attack. To counter this, she launched more poison, but he evaded everything. However, now things had changed. Our protagonist was closer than ever to her. Seeing this, she thought she had an opportunity. But it was useless. With a single strike, our protagonist managed to cut her. But even though he cut her, he noticed that she could regenerate. Regenerating, she became furious because he had left a cut on her. Now she could no longer wear a bikini. So she used her full power, and our protagonist did the same, their powers clashing against each other. When they collided, she commented that he had a good memory. When her power and our protagonist's power met, it turned into a venomous mist. In the end, it was only a matter of time before our protagonist lost his armor. It wouldn't last forever. He even questioned if this was really happening. Then he extended his hand into her mist, and once again ignited a more powerful fire. She was startled by that power, but soon flames engulfed her. After everything, we saw him standing there, calmly watching it all unfold. He realized he had gained 400 levels. But even that wasn't enough to kill her. Elsewhere, we saw her getting up among the rocks. She had used her poison again to deceive that adventurer. Unfortunately, she had to do this, because it was very likely that, when she returned, she would seek revenge. She couldn't kill him, but she could eliminate weaker adventurers. However, while thinking about this, she noticed a blade approaching. To avoid being struck, she lowered her horns. Still, they ended up being cleanly sliced off, but at that moment, as she dodged, we saw a hand appearing behind her. Now, after it emerged, she asked herself where this monster had come from. But there was no time for questions or answers because our hero's shadow hurled flames at her, sending her flying. Yet, even that wasn't enough to defeat her. That's when the Holy Knight appeared. With his sword, he struck a slash that finally managed to cut her in half again, but it still wasn't enough. And then the last summoning appears. That shield he had taken before, and that engulfs that girl. But this summoning he had invoked was supposed to try to swallow that girl, which they didn't want, as it was very likely that the protagonist wanted to summon it as a shadow for himself. But even after all that, he realizes that she was still alive. Only now she had a choice, to become his ally or to die himself. She then ends up refusing. She was basically one of those who belonged to the strongest demonic clan, and she would not lower herself to be an ally of a human. For this, He takes his sword and ends up asking her to go to another world. She even said that dying was actually better than being an ally of those humans. Then the cut happened, but nothing happens until she realizes that all the wounds have healed. When she looks up, she sees that those allies of our hero were looking at her with a smile. Then someone comments that she was still alive. As she gets up and looks back, she finds our protagonist with a slightly greater presence than before. Thus, on her knees, she ends up calling our protagonist Mech. After all this, we then observe our protagonist gaining many things, giving weapons to the shadows, including this one, who now at the moment managed to feel much stronger now, having someone by his side to guide him. While the shadows celebrated, we could then see, appearing in the background, someone calling for Yongqing. And in the background, we see that it was that giant. She comments that she gave all the healing potions to them, but nothing helped. Their experiments were too deep. He then goes to them to heal them, but his shadow appears, saying that there was no need to do that, as they themselves would do it, and he extends his hand toward them, now healing them. We then see our protagonist thinking that it was fortunate that they were in this dungeon. They managed to level up a lot, also making him rise from the lowest level to a higher level. But he doesn't understand why those golems that were chasing the dwarf ended up turning into these things after the boy's defeat. At that moment, his new shadow appears, commenting that she knows about some very important chests in this dungeon that he could be taking, and thus she could be guiding our hero. As soon as she says this, we observe that the other shadow of our hero is furious with her for trying to steal his position as the strongest shadow. While the two shadows argue, we observe below the hero's friend, who was lying on the ground. But even after healing him, he realized that his hand had not returned to its natural state. However, in any case, the protagonist sees that they are fine. Then he turns to the giant and asks her to go to the city and take them, as there they could find a high-quality priest, and with that priest he could recover his hand. She then obeys and takes them away. But to leave this dungeon completely safely, they needed a strong shadow to guide them. So he asks this shadow to guide him, and he agrees. As they leave with the shadow, we observe our protagonist heading in another direction. Since the beginning of this battle, he realizes that there is still a level 4 adventurer missing. This guy must be planning something. But if he tries anything against our hero's team, he doesn't even worry, because with him, he has a level 7 shadow. So he shouldn't be concerned. Then the scene shifts to them, where we can see the giant talking to that shadow. But the shadow wonders why she was putting a cloth over the dwarf. Then she responds that his armor was completely burned. So in short, the dwarf has no clothes left. After saying such things, the summoning begins to comment that things like this made no sense at all. But while walking around, he feels that he has fallen into a trap. Seeing that he was about to be caught, he jumps up to avoid being captured. But even after jumping, we observe that a chain grabs his arms and pulls him toward the ground. To avoid being pulled down, he ends up cutting that chain, but other chains clearly appear now from various directions. Those chains bind our protagonist's shadow. Meanwhile, the giant asks him to wait, as she would be helping him. But he tells her to stay put, as she needed to focus on other things. Someone was after her. He could free himself alone, and behind, we observe that adventurer smiling. But that shadow of our protagonist, with a single movement, manages to free himself. So, knowing that this shadow is powerful, we then see him activating another ability of his to finally capture this shadow. But while all this is happening, the scene cuts to another place where we find our hero opening a chest. After opening this chest, he takes a rare weapon. Upon obtaining this rare weapon, we observe the shadow praising our protagonist. However, while praising him, he feels the presence of something strange happening, which makes Natal, the shadow of our hero, sad, wondering what is wrong with this chest. The chest does not satisfy her. She comments that by moving further ahead, he will find even better chests. However, he now remarks that the chests she gave him had nothing wrong with them, but rather that other things were happening. so he asks her to look for some chests. She understands, and at that moment, our hero disappears. The scene then returns to that previous location, where we find the giant falling to the ground. Meanwhile, ahead, we observe that level 4 hunter who had been missing all this time. He stood in front of the shadow of our hero, which was trapped in some kind of sticky mud or something similar. He tried to escape, but the man told him not to try. This was an ability that trapped anything inside, and once caught, no one could ever get out. But there was no need to worry because he would be taking him out of that sticky thing. It is revealed that he was Zurin, a level 7 fighter. Meanwhile, we observe the shadow screaming for him not to do such a foolish thing. If he did, he would suffer the consequences, not at his hands, but at the hands of his boss. But he does not care about that. His strength was too great. At that moment, the shadow, frightened, asks how he managed to level up so much. He then reveals that before joining this group, he was level 6, but after the boss died, he ended up leveling up to level 7. Then they ask what was happening. While our hero was fighting the boss, he had been dealing with those weak golems, and that was basically what made him level up significantly. After all this is revealed, he then asks his master if he heard everything. However, now, the level 7 adventurer tells him not to start crying so soon. He then picks up his sword and throws it in his direction. But before the sword can reach him, another sword appears, stopping the attack from hitting the shadow of our protagonist. We then see that our hero appeared there out of nowhere. Standing on top of his sword, he managed to stay on his feet. Now that he had heard the whole story, he no longer needed to hold back. The level S fighter stands there, mouth agape, unable to believe how someone could summon the master right in front of him. At that moment, as he remained in shock, a shadow appears behind him and almost grabs him. But he then uses his ability, causing a rock to rise and immobilize that shadow. After this, he goes towards our hero to try to land a blow. However, now our hero manages to dodge, but it is not enough, as he activates another trap that encloses our protagonist in some kind of cage. Even though he was strong and fast, he would not be escaping this time. Now trapped in this cage, the captor closes his hand, sealing our hero inside. He wonders if this actually worked, until he suddenly feels an enormous pressure. At that moment, the cage explodes and he manages to escape everything. Meanwhile, elsewhere, we see him constructing another trap to keep things under control. He then comments that escaping now will not be easy, as he has also placed many traps at the exit. But as he talks about this, a monster appears beside him. He tells the monster to shut up, but after it roars, we then see the shadow of our protagonist locating him. Now that it has found him, it throws a powerful fire in his direction. However, he cannot stay there any longer, so he starts running toward the portal. While running, he realizes that his summoning is much stronger than the others, but dealing with it is also difficult. It flies. To handle this shadow, he will have to use some spikes. Suddenly, he looks up and notices something strange appearing. What appeared was practically a sword that almost hit him, but in the end, he managed to dodge. The only thing that was cut were some rocks. In the end, all the traps he had set were triggered, and now resetting them all would be incredibly difficult, practically impossible. While he talks about this, someone appears behind him and tells him that he cannot escape. We then see that it was the boss of this floor. After that, she throws poison in his direction. After all this, we see our protagonists commenting that their illusions were quite unfair, but now, in the end, it worked perfectly. But she asks to let it end with him. And our protagonist even comments that now was the right time to settle things with him. Minutes later, we see that he has turned into a shadow. He can't believe what is happening. Looking ahead, he sees another shadow. The other shadow comments, "Welcome to the group." But now, our hero has a task for his shadows. The first shadow is chosen to go to a nearby hospital, transform into a human, and live its life as another person. The one in front of him is to go to the dungeons and obtain chests so that he can get good items. No matter the situation, all chests must be taken, as they will be converted into resources for our hero. Now, he will return to his guild and go back to his common life. He will also report to his guild that he has completed his mission, to kill our protagonist. But this is part of his plan. There he is gathering special information to deliver to our protagonist. After saying this, he agrees and disappears. Our story continues. After everything that happened with the protagonist, the scene cuts to another location, where we find several people wondering why the tanks and adventurers aren't able to stop a single boss. Below, we are introduced to this boss. It was a level 10 wild boss. The boss ran toward the group while they ran, continuously pleading for a shield or for someone stronger to appear. If things continued this way, the entire group would be devastated by this single boss. While running, Ro comments that the high-level archer was on his way. Meanwhile, nearby, at the top of some rocks, we find an archer who is better known as the president of a certain guild. While he hasn't appeared yet, we then see a tank stepping forward. He simply asks to be healed. If healed, he will be able to hold off this monster for a few minutes. As soon as he says this, we see an adventurer appearing from behind. She is best known as a healer. She uses her healing ability on the tank, restoring his strength. He then activates his shield ability. Now with his shield activated, he can easily defeat this boss. Before, he was wounded and took a whole minute to hold it off, but this time, perhaps he would need only 10 seconds to hold back such a monster. However, at that very moment, the monster appears. With a single punch, it strikes the shield, shattering it instantly. But that wasn't all. With that punch, the tank is sent flying backward with immense force. After a moment, he crashes into the mountain wall, cracking it completely. His group stares in shock. A single blow was enough to break this incredible tank's defense. Such was the monster's power. The monster's shadow then appears near the background characters, who turn around, trembling with fear. They now realize this is the end for them, until one of them points upward and exclaims that it's the president of the Blue Guild. Looking up, we see him standing there, looking down. At that moment, the guards and adventurers notice his presence. They are filled with joy. As they celebrate, the adventurer suddenly leaps from that height. His speed is extremely high. As he falls toward the boss, we see the boss preparing to strike, aiming to finish him off in a single blow. However, at the same time, the adventurer is also preparing his attack. Once ready, he throws his punch, and the boss does the same. The two punches meet mid-air. The stronger one would be the victor. Then, the adventurer delivers a more powerful punch. His punch is so strong that it pushes the boss's arm slightly backward. But this alone is not enough. Defeating the boss would be easy. With a single powerful fist, he crushes the boss. Not only does he defeat it, but he also humiliates it. After all this, we see the boss being crushed deeper and deeper into the ground. The adventurer's attack was overwhelmingly powerful. A girl wonders if they might be affected by the impact. Another person comments that the bald guy was confident they wouldn't get caught in it. Until minutes later, they realize they actually were. The girl screams. And while he, let's say, is being crushed, to avoid the same fate, they then begin to running. But while running, we see that it was all in vain. The girl and the other adventurer were caught by his ability, and everyone around was sent to another place. Not a very good one. After all this destruction, we see something flying to another location, but this thing suddenly stops right in front of an adventurer. The adventurer looks at it and is surprised to see that the president was, let's say, more arrogant and crazier than before. However, for him, this thing wasn't all that surprising anymore. He ignores it all because the president tells him to step aside, or the same thing will happen to him. But he ignores the warning and begins to tell a story. The president, however, asks him to stop with this nonsense and questions why he is there. The adventurer then vaguely mentions that he has good news. It was about a certain assassination, a certain Zoe. He had finally completed his revenge, and now he had come to inform him. He then turns slightly and tells him not to talk about such matters with him. After all that, he was about to leave, but before that he asked if, by any chance, the president would be attending a private meeting with those angels Later in the afternoon, upon hearing the word angels, the president's gaze shifts. Something emanates from his eyes, and it moves toward the adventurer. He is caught by it and falls to his knees. After this, the president warns him not to speak of things he shouldn't, or dangerous situations will arise for him. After saying that, the adventurer apologizes, and the president then leaves. Left alone, the adventurer feels a bit overwhelmed. Even after reaching level 7, he was still crushed by the immense pressure of that so-called president. But that was a matter for later. Unfortunately, he was nowhere near the president's level, but he hoped that his master would at least allow him to train under him. With that, it was highly likely that in the future, he would surpass the president's strength. Since there was nothing else to do, he would have to go hunting some monsters to level up a bit more. Meanwhile, in the Temple of Angels, we find the president walking around. He arrives at a certain location and kneels, stating that the supposed survivor from years ago had appeared, but there was no need to worry. The matter had already been resolved. Now that he had settled that issue rather triumphantly, he requested that the boss behind the scenes hand over a key to some epic portals. The boss laughs in his face, saying that he had merely dealt with a trivial matter and was demanding such a high reward for it. This was an insult to him. After this, he realizes that the young angel has a sense of humor. However, for adventurers above level 10, it takes a great deal of effort to achieve higher rankings, as high-level monsters are hard to come by. If they only encounter monsters or adventurers of the same level, they won't be able to level up much, not to mention that the strongest bosses are scarce, and there isn't much they can do. Finding such monsters was rare. Even so, he asks that they at least hand over the key, as over the years, he had done plenty of dirty work for these angels in their place. One of the guards overhears this and becomes irritated. He then asks the president if he isn't afraid of losing his life for speaking that way. Drawing his sword in a single motion, he attacks with the intention of destroying him. But then, someone behind a door commands him to stop. He obeys, but not before his strike cuts halfway through the president's spines. At that moment, the figure behind the door begins to speak, saying that if he hadn't chosen him in that dungeon, he and his tribe members would have been exterminated. In the end, it was good for him to take over just a small guild that existed. Around there and taking care of her, he then thanks for that. After saying something like that, something falls near his side, catching his attention. He turns around, and as he does, he is surprised by the tear left behind with a single movement made by that adventurer, or one of those angelic guards. In the background, we see that the cut was not just a simple cut. With a single sword movement, he nearly split the mountain in half. Realizing the strength of these guards, he understands that these mere guards around here are much stronger than he is, as just one of them could kill him at any moment with a single move. He then continues to ask if by any chance they are giving him the key. While he grows anxious about it, the scene is suddenly cut to another location, somewhere like a bridge. There we find the boy standing in front of a portal. Facing the portal, they ask if he is here to buy a key. After hearing that, he responds that he is, and then he is told to stop talking nonsense and wasting time. He then calls our hero to step inside now. Once inside, he mentions that since he was introduced by Zen from the Zir Guild, they will grant him permission to enter. Besides, fighting is not allowed here, since if anyone tries to fight against them, they will be punished by a high-level archmage. So if he does not want any trouble, he just needs to follow orders. He agrees with that, and they move forward. As they advance, the protagonist notices that the black market for adventurers is hidden to prevent them from being dragged in by those angelic figures. He finds this quite clever. Upon hearing that, he is told that inside he can also find some high-level products that are controlled by major corporations, especially a dungeon key. A certain Zuri requested him to come and retrieve this key. Before proceeding, the protagonist takes a gold bar out of his pocket and hands it over to the adventurer. After doing so, the adventurer grabs onto him and comments that he is a rookie and does not know much about the rules here. However, giving him that gold might not necessarily be breaking any rules. Knowing this, He remarks that it is nothing serious, and the adventurer accepts the gift. Since there is a gigantic line and it would take too long, the adventurer calls the protagonist, saying there is a shortcut. If he stays in this line, it will take him several days to get the key. All the adventurers here are looking for a key, and it seems that the rookie is also after one. Before anything else, he will give him a good education about dungeon keys. These are only necessary for adventurers once they reach level 10. He then explains that dungeons are divided into different levels. The first is the easy level, where no key is required. However, once a person reaches level 10, they will need keys, though the loot inside is quite bad, and fighting the monsters will be very easy. Then there is another level, the more difficult one, where much stronger monsters can be found. Additionally, the items inside are very good. There are also herbs that help one reach level 20 much faster, but to enter this place, one must already be level 20. The next level is the epic level. Inside, adventurers will face balanced monsters with considerable strength. However, they will also find many valuable rewards, including excellent items. But to enter, one must be at least level 30 or higher. Even so, a very high level is needed to survive inside. Lastly, there is the legendary level. The difficulty there is extremely high, but the materials found are incredibly valuable. There is also a higher chance of finding superior level resources. However, there is a catch. Entering this dungeon requires both money and a team, because inside, having an extremely high-level team will require luck because encountering a monster inside is a bit more difficult than usual. So, after all this, he understands that there must be a dungeon that, upon reaching level 40, or perhaps level 40 is the maximum level so far, he comments that no dungeon has ever even managed to reach level 41. No one has reached level 41 until today. Not even the only adventurer who got that far, since for those adventurers who had already been in that infernal level dungeon, not even the only one from there managed to survive. Then he asks everyone to stop talking and listen so that everyone pays attention, because now he will begin the auction for the keys. And so, he shows a level 10 key and asks if anyone is interested. One person points and offers 5,000. He comments that he will be paying 5,000 until another person speaks up and offers 7,000. He then looks at her and wonders where that girl came from. Meanwhile, the protagonist was busy handling his summons when suddenly a guy appeared, telling him to choose that dungeon, since the level 10 dungeon was possible for him. There, by paying 100,000, one could enter, and by the end, the dungeon master would be profiting 200,000, not to mention the expenses for the allied adventurers. Thinking twice, he realized he should not even consider the epic level dungeon, as he, being only level 7, would not be able to get through it, not even in his dreams. Then someone speaks up, offering 12,000. Hearing 12,000, the auctioneer points to him and announces that he is the new owner of the key. After that, some mages and adventurers approach him, saying they could help him clear that dungeon. We then see two of them following that guy without thinking twice. They are now lost on a path. Then, he points to another direction. Now, there is another dungeon key. This dungeon, for him, was a premium dungeon. He claps his hands to get everyone's attention. Now that the previous key was sold, he will announce the next one. This next key will have much more prominence. It is a level 10 epic rank key. The people present in that place start commenting that it was not worth it. The price was high, and hiring adventurers would be quite expensive since it was necessary to have high-level adventurers. Some even leave, noting that there were guilds that had only high-level adventurers who went into those dungeons. So, many opt out of it, until a certain president appears, offering 500,000. Everyone is left speechless upon hearing this, amazed at how generous he was. The price was generous as well, and everyone was sure he would be able to complete that mission. He even comments that only he could do it, and that if one truly wanted to become strong, they had to model their strength after this guy. But then, the scene shifts outside, where we find him mentioning that a certain old man also attended the event, looking to acquire some key. However, before anything else, He asks him if he happens to recognize him. The protagonist's shadow comments that no, that President still does not recognize his face. Even without recognizing his face, the protagonist wonders why that person suddenly wants to get that epic-level key. To this, he responds to the protagonist that he recently went to the Temple of Angels and suddenly returned. Perhaps he was stimulated by something. Now, returning to the auction, he wonders if anyone dares to challenge him in this bidding war. Then, someone raises their hand and announces that they will be offering 600,000. At that moment, he wonders, who was this person? That girl? For this, he raises the money to 1 million. While increasing the price, the protagonist turns to this guy and wonders why he was raising the price so much. He responds that this was an epic-level dungeon, but after all, just level 10 requires a great chance to demand a gigantic number. But the scene returns to him. He ends up stepping onto the stage saying that he will be paying 1.5 million. With this price, no one here is crazy enough to bid higher than him. On stage, she announces another price. He turns to her and is surprised because she appeared again. Then he raises the price to 2 million, but she increases it to 2.1 million, and so this number keeps rising to 2, 3, 4, up to 5. Now he realizes that she was doing all this on purpose, and if she was really just playing around, he raises it to 5 million. After saying 5 million, everyone is left speechless. In reality, level 10, his movements are still much more arrogant. The key was worth 200,000 at the beginning, and now it has risen to 5 million. Still, he wonders if she has the courage. Looking at her, she starts saying some things that make him begin to think about life. After thinking for a bit, he tries to look for that girl. After searching for a long time, he realizes that she was no longer around. She vanished. He runs out, and after running, he turns to that guy and asks if by any chance he knows where that girl went. After realizing that all of this was a setup to make him spend all that money, he is left in limbo, understanding almost nothing. Now, if he happens to meet that woman again, he will definitely be seeking revenge, not only for basically humiliating him in front of everyone, but also for making him spend all that money. Leaving the dungeon now, he apologizes, our protagonist, for nothing, and also for that crazy girl who appeared out of nowhere. However, he withdraws and ends up saying that now he has the protagonist's contact. If a really good item appears, he will be calling the protagonist, and with that, they disappear. But next to the protagonist, she appeared. The girl who had deceived that guy, that president, the entire time. And after she appears, he celebrates, saying that what they did in there to that lizard was simple. He just used psychology on him, and that was also incredible for them. However, the girl was not worried about what she had done to that guy, but rather about the money. If that money ended up in their pockets, they would be totally rich at this moment. But well, what she says makes total sense. Behind them, we find the person who says this. After that, she is surprised and realizes that he was the auctioneer from before, leaving her stunned until she realizes that he was also part of the demon clan. It's very likely that the protagonist did the same thing as her. He agrees that he did, and for this, we reveal that the protagonist, while on stage, realized that he was part of the demon clan. This was felt in his own aura, so he thought of using him to his advantage, which is not surprising, as he suddenly started giving instructions to increase the auction value of that dungeon, and now he shows a card and comments that at the moment he has 4 million, but he is still missing 1 million to complete the 5. And now that it's been credited, that guy is going to be rich. We see the girl wondering if this was the key. Well, maybe it was because it was the only one available at the auction today. And now, in the protagonist's account, he realizes that he has quite a good amount of money. Minutes later, someone thanks him. Seeing this guy, he was a level 10 assassin, but now he managed to get a much cheaper key than buying it at that auction house. But why is a key bought at the dungeon entrance cheaper? To this, he responds that all the teammates of that person's party died inside the dungeon, and it was pure luck that he managed to come out alive. And at this moment, the key he has is the only one in his hands. If by any chance it were sold on the market, he could sell it for a very high price. While entering the dungeon, we observe a creature behind him, watching everything the protagonist was doing. But meanwhile, we see the president with that lizard, seeing that the girl from before had obtained a new key, and knowing that only 2 people had entered there, he orders 3 of the guards who were with him to enter along with him. After pointing at them, he starts sweating and comments that fighting those 2 inside was nothing, but fighting the president, he didn't want to enter the dungeon. It was difficult, but he had to enter. But the moment he tries to go inside, he has a surprise. Upon entering, he receives a system message saying that the dungeon is full. However, they ask how it is full, considering that only 2 had entered just moments ago. How did 3 more people manage to enter without him even noticing? Seeing that they couldn't enter, the guards behind him celebrate. However, the president turns around and says that they don't have any more time to waste here because they will be focusing on their own dungeons later. X's went with that girl who entered along with the protagonist inside this dungeon. Meanwhile, inside the dungeon, we see the protagonist thanking his group for helping him reach level 10. However, now that he has reached level 10, he has good news for each of his shadows. From now on, each of them will be able to recruit their own followers. This is because, upon reaching level 10, the system granted him a new ability. This ability allows his shadows to convert players or monsters into their own followers as well. His shadows immediately celebrate with cries of joy. Meanwhile, we see her looking at the first shadow the protagonist acquired, wondering if it isn't ashamed, and whether it is even listening to the fact that the protagonist still has more to say. However, the shadow replies that it isn't ashamed, as there is a very good monster ahead, and the protagonist's shadow wants that particular shadow for itself. Moreover, the Lord himself will be summoning them right there, at the protagonist's location. Now, their goal is to look for small, strong, or weak servants, as whoever manages to gather the most followers will draw the protagonist's attention. With that, they all begin to disappear into the depths of the dungeon. Meanwhile, he wonders what is happening outside. Natal comments that Chui took some of his team members to fight in his own dungeon. However, that guy tried looking for him earlier. We also see that this guy has gained a new ability, an ability that allows him to hide in the dark without anyone being able to see his presence. Now, he will remain here to observe everything that is about to happen. Inside the dungeon, we find that particular shadow of the protagonist, who notices that there are monsters ahead. These monsters are mining ore. However, one of the boss monsters senses the presence of the protagonist's shadow. This boss was a level 10 miner. Upon seeing the shadow, he points and orders the remaining guards to attack the mysterious intruder. As soon as he says that, we see them all flying toward the shadow. In reality, fighting them was a hassle, so he decides to use a skill fusion. Now, he uses his burning fire from before, but this time, something appears behind it. It was that poison. That poison engulfs him completely. Moments later, the poison, combined with his fire, spreads toward the miners. We then witness the destruction it caused. All the miners were massacred and taken down by that girl's ability. However, at the moment he realizes that someone stole his kills and his shadows, he gets irritated. He then turns and starts blaming her as well. She had almost killed him too, but he had a shield, so there was no need to worry about that. However, the girl looks ahead and comments that someone has appeared and interfered with her plans. The summons that were supposed to go to the protagonist's first shadow had been summoned by another of the protagonist's shadows. At that moment, he turns and shouts at him to stop stealing his shadows. However, the other completely ignores the protagonist's first shadow and orders his new shadows to follow him, as it was necessary to farm XP. And today, we're continuing with a little sequel for you all. But before we start the video, I want to let you know that this will be a full summary of Manhwa, from Chapter 1 to Chapter 21, up to the point where I found this Manhwa. As soon as new chapters come out, I'll bring them here for you right away. After one of the shadows lost Raki, the other one ended up taking advantage of the opportunity. It seems like it's capturing them and turning them into its servants. And only after all of this, we see that shadow was actually scheming as they advance toward the remains of the monsters to farm more XP. Who gives more XP? The protagonist. The more XP they get, the more attention he pays to them. Meanwhile, FMAV, all the XP was going to the protagonist. It just kept increasing for him. While all of this was happening, in another place, we also saw some guys destroying weaker monsters, like some kind of giant mutant cockroaches. After taking them down one by one, suddenly, that president appears from behind. He immediately starts complaining, saying that these players are too weak. They have the assassin classification, but what's the point? If he, the president, weren't here, everyone would be dead. So he orders them to at least follow him. They obey and advance forward, eventually reaching the level 10 boss. Now this boss that appeared was easily taken down by the protagonist's shadow. After everyone was defeated, we see them all lying on the ground, and from behind, we find the protagonist who had just arrived. He realizes that his shadows had gotten much stronger in that time, and not just that, he could be lying in the back, doing nothing, and still leveling up. Now, the kid had just reached level 11, but as he placed his hand in front of the boss, he noticed how weak it was, something he didn't want at the moment. However, just as he was thinking about not wanting to absorb those shadows, a portal appeared right in front of him. As soon as it showed up, he ordered the shadows behind him to mine. Once everything was mined, it was easy. Just return to Earth, head to the black market, and sell everything for a good price. After setting up this whole plan, he withdrew from the portal. Then, in the next portal, his shadows were able to easily kill a strong boss. Elsewhere, other shadows had taken down weaker monsters. This way, the protagonist kept leveling up rapidly inside the epic dungeon. He realized that the dungeon was way too easy. At first, he thought it would be difficult. At this moment, he had already reached level 19. Meanwhile, in another location, the scene shifts to one of the bosses holding a quaz by the head. This quaz, who was being held, cried out for help since the boss that grabbed him was level 14. With no way out, we see the president move his hand forward, and in an instant he manages to destroy that boss. Along with it, he also wiped out some of the weaker guards that were getting in the way of his farming. After defeating the monster, he turns to the group and starts complaining again. They finally reached level 15, but looking back, only 2 of those hunters remained. At that moment, he even wondered why he had hired these people, since he carried the whole team by himself. However, one of the background characters calls out to the president and asks him to look behind. He turns around, confused, only to see a monster's leg appearing. This was a boss of a slightly higher level, but its level wasn't displayed to us. This suggests that it was a boss that entered this territory on its own. The president even wondered if there wasn't some kind of seal in this portal. But to put an end to this nonsense, he attacked the monster with one of his powers. The attack hit it directly, smashing it into the ground. After crushing it, guess what? He immediately started celebrating. The president was already rejoicing because, with this attack, it should have been impossible for that monster to walk away unscathed. So, at that moment, to confirm whether he had truly defeated it, he approached to take a look. He did get closer, but as soon as he reached the spot, he was in for a surprise. The monster was still standing, facing him in a rather humble way while humility filled the air. Our wonderful scene shifts to another location on Earth. Now, we see someone emerging from the portal, and meanwhile, a guy is surprised to see that the one who came out was not the president. Since it wasn't him, he ends up asking the guy to stop because, well, he was leaving and something needed to be done. The commission. He couldn't pass through without paying the commission. The protagonist, who couldn't care less anymore, wonders what that guy's deal was. If he knew, he would be shocked. He was from the famous Zuma Guild. Their leader was crazy, diving into any dungeon he could find just to level up. He was working hard to achieve that goal. However, the protagonist, already tired of these guys, ends up saying that if, by any chance, he refused to pay, then the guy reveals that if he didn't pay, they would beat him up so badly he wouldn't even be able to walk. But just as he opened his eyes to say that, something flew by, catching the protagonist's attention. He points out that maybe the one who was supposed to beat him up was actually the one flying. So he decides to look up and is met with a surprise. It was the president. He was flying out of the portal, crashing among the trees. Then we see what really did that to him. It was that mysterious BOSS. It jumped up and was now heading toward the protagonist, who was still in the middle of a conversation with that guy. Its leap was incredible. It jumped from the portal straight onto a mountain. Now, on top of the mountain, we see that its impact was so powerful that the whole mountain trembled. Witnessing all of this, the guy just backs away because it was terrifying. A boss escaping from a dungeon? He even begged the protagonist to run because if he stayed there, he would definitely die. As he pleaded, the scene shifts to another place. People who were in the forest all started running away. They didn't want to stay there because they had received a message saying that a very powerful boss had appeared. After everyone fled, we returned to him. He was staring at the president, who was lying on the ground. Now we see the boss deciding to place its hand on the ground, and after doing so, it pulls a gigantic rock from the earth. Then, with that, it lifts the rock and hurls it toward the president. Seeing this, the president realizes that this is bad. That enormous rock was getting closer and closer to him, and to avoid being crushed, a background figure appears. A female adventurer who uses her fire magic. Her attack was strong enough to explode the rock. The one who did that was the slender adventurer, a level 30, and the president of the ST Guild. The knight standing behind her is left speechless, seeing that their president didn't even manage to see the boss's attack, while she successfully hit it from a long distance. But she wasn't done yet. She still hadn't managed to bring the boss down completely. Meanwhile, the scene shifts back to the president. He was completely wrecked until he saw someone appearing in the shadows. Seeing this figure approach, he realizes it's an ally. It was also the protagonist's companion, a former comrade of his. He even questions whether the fallen president wasn't feeling ashamed of being on the ground like that. The president, still on the ground, asks if it was him who took him down. However, his goal wasn't to save him. He was a hunter who relied on weapons and traps to handle anything, and yet he managed to neutralize one of the boss's strongest attacks. That was surprising, but what truly scared him was that he couldn't see his level. He even considered that he might be a shitter, meaning someone capable of hiding their level. Only that could explain everything. But at that moment, he looks up just in time to see one of the rocks flying toward him. It hits him completely. Meanwhile, we find the boss rushing toward him. But before the attack could land, something struck the boss directly in the face. The one who did that was the archer, who used a long-distance attack. Since he managed to land a direct hit on the boss's face, the boss simply jumps, leaping at an incredible speed toward the archer. The archer, seeing him approaching, grabs another arrow, but this arrow contained a trap. This trap was simply a net, a magical net. This net ends up catching the boss. The boss, having been caught, simply couldn't move anymore, which ultimately made him crash face first into the mountain. Meanwhile, he asks the protagonist to unleash his other form, the demonic form, because in this form he becomes stronger. His strength increases by 30%, and if he takes damage, that damage is converted into additional power, increasing his strength by 15% for every hit he receives. The protagonist acknowledges that he would indeed become stronger, but he cannot show his strength now, as there are many spectators. He does not want to attract a reputation as a powerhouse just yet. The Shadow had a good option. If he didn't want the humans to see him, it would be better to kill them. The protagonist refuses, saying he wants the humans to watch everything as mere spectators. However, the boss manages to escape from the net and climbs to the top where the protagonist's shadow is. But the shadow is one step ahead. Spikes emerge from the ground and strike the boss, immobilizing him for a few moments. Even though it only stalls him briefly, it also causes him minor damage. Not much, but still something. While creating strategies to defeat the boss, we see that the guild from before is observing everything. They realize that this boss is 4 levels above that hunter. The knight beside them remarks that it's very likely he will lose, but there is a chance he could win if he uses good strategies. For example, she once defeated a boss with an attack power 3 times higher than hers, but that was special, as she had been chosen among the best. It was unlikely that the low-ranked guy down there would have the same chance she did. However, something about what he said surprises her. She even wonders if that adventurer could truly withstand all that power. Meanwhile, the scene shifts back to him. He runs, and as he does, he triggers his traps at full speed. Moments later, the traps disappear from sight, but the boss accidentally activates one. Upon activation, an explosion occurs. However, even this is not enough to bring down the boss. The strategy he is using is good. He only wants to wear the boss down, but he is being too naive. At this point, we see the boss activating his rage mode. Now, he runs even faster than before. The more enraged he becomes, the faster he moves. To escape, the protagonist activates another trap, one that binds the boss to the ground. As the boss steps forward, both his feet get caught in the sticky trap. Now immobilized, the protagonist's shadow takes up his bow and begins aiming at the boss, who struggles to break free. Meanwhile, one of the onlookers comments that the trap wasn't bad, but the real problem was his aim. However, another girl argues that it wasn't so simple. Just then, one of the arrows strikes the boss. But these were not just ordinary arrows, they were modified. As the arrows pierce the monster, sparks begin to fly. Moments later, a massive explosion erupts, leaving the knight and the unknown girl stunned. They couldn't believe how powerful the effect was. The protagonist looks toward the explosion. He sees only smoke, nothing else. But the two watching from behind shout at him not to lose focus. As it isn't over yet, looking up, we see the boss. He had jumped. Now he dives straight at the adventurer, and it's highly likely that he was hit. With a single punch, the boss sends the protagonist's shadow flying. He is launched into the trees, preventing him from flying even farther than he already was. He then uses his own trap to catch himself. He is now held by his own device. At that moment, she appears, another shadow of the protagonist. She had only been waiting for one thing, for him to ask for help. And only after a moment, he finally says that he needs her help. She then begins to... He moves his arms, but here, it's better for him to hold his breath. Being the arrogant one he is, he ends up saying that he is dying in her hands, and that poison she threw spreads throughout the entire forest. The monster ends up being surrounded by all that poison, but he already knew a way to dissipate it. So he spreads his hands apart, and only after that, he gathers it into a single hand, creating a kind of shockwave. The shock was so strong that it managed to completely dissipate all the poison around him. Meanwhile, the two adventurers watching the fight are surprised by the poisonous mist. But now, we see the boss staring at the spot where the shadow of the dark figure was. Without knowing where he was, he keeps trying to stare at him, but nothing happens, except for the traps being thrown in his direction once again. Those dark things got close to him, and then he set them on fire. And you know what happens? Explosion. And trust me, a wonderful little explosion. I just think that explosion finished off that boss, but actually did it. Our deer, however, remains. To find out if it's really over, unfortunately, we will have to discover everything in the next part. Our video for today is already coming to an end. And before I go, leave your like below, and also comment on what you thought of these new chapters, or what you thought of this boss. But I think I'll be going now. Maybe I'll see you around, or maybe I'll see you in the next part, right?